ask that you save your questions until the end of the presentation, and that you type them into the chat. I will act as moderator and read out the question, and then our panelists will reply. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. We do have another DLG track session this afternoon on building community through digitization events, and that's at 2 p.m. The second part of digitization on a shoestring is going to take place tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. We hope that you will join us. And another DLG webinar event is our second town hall of 2020, and that will be on July 18th at 2 p.m. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. First off, we've got Angela Stanley. She is the director of Georgia Homeplace, and prior to working at Homeplace, she was the head of the Heritage Room at Athens Clarke County Public Library. Angela works closely with public libraries and the Digital Library of Georgia to build digitization capacity in the state. So without further ado, I'm gonna hand it off to Angela.
Great, thank you so much, Sheila. So yes, thank you for that great introduction, and welcome to today's part one of today's presentation on digitization on a shoestring. As Sheila mentioned, I'm director of Georgia Homeplace for the Georgia Public Library Service. And if you are unfamiliar with GPLS, we are Georgia's state library and part of the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia. You can check out our website at georgialibraries.org to learn more about GPLS. And I did want to give a quick plug. I'm joined today also by Mary Willoughby, the Digital Conversion and Curation Librarian for the Digital Library of Georgia. And Mary will be leading part two of this presentation tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Slide. So we've got, Mary, if you would just head back one slide, thank you. Today in the part one, we are going to talk about three distinct topics: project planning, metadata, and some tips and resources for planning your digital project. Tomorrow, Mary will talk about imaging, quality control and post-processing, and digital preservation. You can see our slide decks at the bit.ly link on our screen, on the screen here, if you want to follow along at home. Slide. All right, so as busy librarians and archivists working for organizations that frequently lack a big budget, it can be easy to assume that doing a project cheaply means doing it ourselves. And while this assumption may be correct in some respects, there are ways to reduce the overall cost of your project that don't involve you working a 14-hour day to get it done. The most important suggestions I can make to you up front as you consider taking on a digital project are to plan and ask questions. In this first section, we'll discuss the challenges inherent in any project, setting project goals and expectations, assessing your bandwidth to take on a project, and the mechanics of digital project management. Slide. Many of you will have seen this good, fast, and cheap image or something similar before, usually with the comment, pick two. If it's good and cheap, it won't be fast. If it's good and fast, it won't be cheap. And if it's fast and cheap, it won't be good. And if it's free, well, you better ask what the catch is. This diagram helps to illustrate the point that everything has a cost, whether you realize it or not. Let's look at this same principle another way. Slide. In this image of the project management triangle, you can see that each corner of the triangle corresponds to a demand. This diagram can be represented mathematically as scope equals time times resources. What can we distill from these two graphics? First, that the quality of work is constrained by the project's budget, deadlines, and scope. Secondly, that the project manager can trade between constraints. And thirdly, that changes in one constraint necessitate changes in others to compensate or quality will suffer. So for example, a project can be completed faster by increasing the budget or cutting the scope. Similarly, increasing the scope may require equivalent increases in budget and schedule. Cutting the budget without adjusting your schedule or your scope will lead to lower quality. Ultimately, your goal is to make sure that your project or your process is in line with your mission statement. If your mission is to provide broad access to all your materials, you may decide to put a lot of content online quickly and pay top dollar. But if your mission is to foster community connections or to provide instruction on research methodology, you can probably expect that it will take a lot more time and money to provide good service, thus narrowing your scope. Unfortunately, small repositories, otherwise known as micro shops, defined as having 1 FTE employee or fewer with an annual budget of less than $5,000, feel these constraints all the more acutely. Ultimately, you want to make sure you can defend why a step takes longer or costs more than others would like. Slide. Consequently, it's important to establish your goals and project deliverables upfront. Otherwise, you or your boss might find yourselves expecting one thing, ta-da, and thank you, Mary, and getting quite another. So goals and expectations will vary from project to project, but I encourage you to be as specific as possible as early as possible. As librarians and archivists, we know that digitization can lead to increased access to information, but it does not guarantee that the digitized materials will be discoverable, interpretable, contextualized, relatable, or otherwise understood. So rather than a broad goal of using digitization to increase access, carefully consider what you actually hope to get out of the project. These reframed goals might include things like reducing original materials handling and preserving brittle, old, or delicate documents, creating standards-aligned archival files that will be digitally preserved in perpetuity, creating connections among and between archival objects and collections to enhance context and understanding, allowing the use of the item or materials in a new or different way than allowed in their analog format. So for example, full text searching or zooming at high levels, enabling access to web quality images from a specific collection in response to community demand, or promoting the value of local history or community-led digitization efforts. If your goals are strictly to create lower resolution access copies on the web, your institution's digitization process will look vastly different from one whose goals are to create long-lasting, high-resolution archival files for permanent retention. Likewise, the format of your materials may impact your goals. Output files for large multi-volume ledger books will probably be different than those for a 5x7 photograph. In most cases, I would recommend you go with the highest standards you can afford, because the more data you capture the first time around, the less likely it is that you will have to subject your materials, your staff, and your volunteers to repeating the project again in a few years. Slide. So this is where we do a quick reality check. What can you reasonably handle at your institution? Maybe you've got a well-trained fleet of committed volunteers ready to roll, but you need help with subject expertise for metadata creation. Perhaps you've got excellent equipment you purchased with grant funds, but only one archive staff person trained in how to use it. Or does your small team have a deep content knowledge and an understanding of fundamental archival principles, but lacks the tech infrastructure to make a project happen? Taking a look at your personal, departmental, and institutional bandwidth can help to additionally clarify what strengths you can leverage and where you might need additional help. There are many tools to help facilitate these analyses, like the SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. The SOAR analysis, strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. and the new to me noise analysis, needs, opportunities, improvements, strengths, and exceptions. All of them ask you to weigh what you've got going for you against what is impeding your success. But by considering these questions up front, you'll be better equipped to make project management decisions that work for your institution as it exists right now. Remember, as far as digitization is concerned, it's far better to successfully complete a modestly sized project than it is to never complete a big one. So with all of that in mind, I ask, slide. What do we talk about when we talk about digitization? Digitization is the process of transforming analog materials into digital form. I like to emphasize the word process here because digitization is iterative, it's repeatable, and it's scalable. I also want to talk about what digitization is not. It is not just scanning. It is not preservation. It is not guaranteed access. It is not without risk. And it is not an easy way to put your entire collection online. Digitization describes a series of tasks that result in a digital object for which you are responsible. Slide. The digitization process typically begins at the top of this cycle with materials selection and project planning. This includes determining early on what it is you plan to digitize and how. Although it's not reflected in this diagram, I also plan from the very beginning how I'm going to promote and use the materials once they're available online. The next step is metadata creation, which we'll talk about in a few moments. The order of this step can sometimes be flip-flopped with the next step, preparation and imaging. But basically, at some point, you'll make your images, and at some point, you'll describe them. The next three steps will be discussed in part 2 of this presentation, taking place at the same time tomorrow. After you have your images, you'll need to do some quality control work and post-processing to make them uniform and usable. Finally, you'll add the images and metadata to whatever digital repository or content management system you're using, being sure to enact steps to ensure the preservation of your shiny new images and metadata records. What I hope you will take away from this graphic is that the digitization process can be broken up into its component steps, discrete chunks of actions that can be performed by different people at different times. Indeed, with a small workforce, this may be the only way a project can be managed. Just remember that this also means that each step can become divorced from the next step. Context and rationale for decisions are easily lost, so it's crucial to document your decisions and project progress. Most of us have, at some point, inherited an existing project that lacked any background information or documentation. Files may not have meaningful names, metadata may be non-existent, our hard drives might have been scattered hither and yon. Don't be that person. If someone else were to come in and pick up where you left off from your project, would they be able to? Slide. Thinking about your digitization project with your project manager's hat on will help avoid some of these missteps and setbacks. We've already discussed the various constraints on all projects, and now we'll talk a little about synthesizing those constraints along with your strengths into a project plan. The information in this slide is derived from the Digital Library Federation's Project Manager's Toolkit, a wiki of the steps and tools that can be used in digital project management. We know that a project must have a defined objective as well as a start and a finish. The finish here is what's crucial. Projects, by their very definition, must end. Those that languish on for years and years cease to be projects and become absorbed into other work functions, and typically do not end with a satisfying result until someone comes in and makes a decision. Thus, projects should not become confused with ongoing work. Project management is the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to carry out a project, and a project manager oversees the full project lifecycle. It's important to note that while there should only be one project manager, this person can be, but is not necessarily, the same individual that is completing each phase of the work. Various project management steps are listed on your screen. Your project proposal is a written document that initiates the project and lays out your high-level plans. It should specifically identify the scope of the project, which should include a description of the materials you plan to digitize. This step will be informed by your research into the materials to determine things like copyright status and an assessment of physical condition, as well as any internal selections criteria, like your collections development statement, that may help you prioritize the digitization of certain materials over others. For example, your department may have a rubric for this selections process that includes factors like geographic distribution, representation of minority and/or underdocumented communities, and potential use cases, all of which will help you narrow your material selection. Your proposal should include a project justification and time cost estimates as well. One great tool to help you estimate these costs is the DLF Digitization Cost Calculator linked to on your screen. You will want to consider early on whether you will do all of the work in-house or if you'll be working with a vendor for any portion of the project. We'll talk more about working with vendors in a little bit. The next step is creating a project charter, which may look very similar to your proposal, but adapted in a way that makes it understandable by a wide variety of stakeholders. This is the document that will communicate expectations, a plan of work, frequency and type of communication, and deliverables to your project partners or stakeholders. It should also clearly state why the project is important and how it supports your institutional mission. You may need this document to be reviewed by a supervisor, a board, community partners, or all of the above. Some institutions use a memorandum of understanding or a service level agreement in lieu of a charter. Once your charter has gone through whatever internal approval process it's subject to, you'll then begin fleshing out your project plans and your schedule of work. This would include a project timeline, milestones and tasks, roles and responsibilities, and project deliverables. During this phase, you may find it helpful to use tools to visualize the schedule, such as a Gantt chart, a Kanban board, or Trello. Additional tools, such as workflows, templates, and standards or guidelines, will also help ensure that work is completed in a uniform manner. At this point, many organizations find it helpful to schedule a kickoff meeting with all project partners and team members to review the charter and the plan of work. This meeting can serve as the official start of the project and helps to build camaraderie, clarify any questions that participants may have, and set clear expectations. From this point, you'll be utilizing and revising your project plan and work schedule according to the digitization process cycle we saw on the previous slide, and working your way through each stage in the process to completion, addressing problems as they arise. Once your project is complete, it's extremely helpful to schedule a retrospective or an evaluation of the project. A group meeting of the project team can be especially helpful in understanding what went well and what you'd change for next time. You may also have promotional obligations or evaluation requirements for funding agencies that need to be completed as part of this process. This meeting also serves as the official end to your project. Finally, a note about sunsetting. For a wide variety of reasons, your institution may need to stop investing time and resources into a project before the project's completion. In these cases, it's important to document the project closeout and communicate to the team and stakeholders. For more information on project sunsetting, you can check out the toolkit link on your screen. Slide. All right. If all of that seems overwhelming, never fear. The project manager has options at their disposal. Many small shops seek out ways to share the work in order to complete a project. These may include pulling in another department for its particular area of expertise, working with other institutions like the State Library or the Digital Library of Georgia for guidance and support, soliciting volunteers to help with repeatable tasks, hiring interns or practicum students from MLIS, archival studies, or maybe public history programs, applying for state, local, or federal grants, some of which, like the DLG subgrant, are a grant of services and not funds, and or contracting with vendors to complete the work, which sometimes costs less than you think it might. Each of these options comes with its own complicating factors around management, cost, and oversight, but are worth exploring as you think of creative solutions for not taking all the work on yourself. Slide. That being said, don't forget that a new project brings with it many opportunities. You have to weigh the benefits and costs of doing the work in-house against your own bandwidth, but let's briefly discuss some of them here. All of these considerations are taken from the Northeast Document Conservation Center's Outsourcing and Vendor Relations leaflet, linked to in the resources slide at the end of this presentation. If you haven't looked through these digital leaflets before, I strongly encourage you to check them out. They are great. All right, so let's look at some of the benefits of doing the work in-house. By conducting a digital project in-house, you and your team get to learn by doing and develop your digital project experience. This will better enable you to take on new projects in the future. You can define or change your requirements incrementally. Now, this doesn't mean that you aren't prepared with your project requirements from the beginning, but you're in control of the process and you have more flexibility to adapt to changing needs. You have total control over your quality requirements because you're doing the work. A bonus for those of you who have a hard time letting go of the reins. You retain direct control over the materials and can ensure security and proper handling. When you work with a vendor, one of the scariest parts is putting your precious materials in a box to be shipped by your carrier of choice. Once they're received by the vendor, they'll be checked in and processed. But as with all things, the more people touching the materials, the greater the chance of error. By keeping the work in-house, you manage the whole process, including the security, handling, and the storage of the materials. Finally, a big benefit is doing the work in-house is that you can manage the primacy of requirements for cultural heritage institutions. Not all scanning or digitization vendors are experienced in working with original materials from galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, and may not be familiar with the particular needs of those materials or able to offer great advice about them. If you do work with a vendor, it's important to make sure they are reputable and experienced. Some disadvantages of doing the work in-house might be fairly obvious, but we'll review them here just the same. Doing the work locally requires larger organizational investment, both in terms of staff time, training, but also technology, physical space, and equipment. Additionally, you have to consider the long-term access to and stewardship of your new digital files. All of these costs add up, and many of them are ongoing. It can take a while to ramp up to full capacity when doing a digital project in-house, especially if you and your team are new to this kind of work. Building up organizational infrastructure takes time. When you digitize items in-house, there is typically no pre-established per page or per item cost. The digitization cost calculator we discussed earlier is one tool to help you get at a final cost estimate, but it will only ever be an estimate. By comparison to a vendor, your institution will, when you digitize items in-house, there is typically no pre-established per page or per item cost. Let's see, I've lost my place. Yes, okay, so by comparison to a vendor, sorry y'all, your institution will likely not have the same level of production facilities and capabilities. The need for space is an often overlooked aspect of doing any kind of in-house digital projects. Mary will talk more about best practices for setting up scanning stations tomorrow, but if you plan to have more than one person operating equipment at a time, you'll need to consider whether you have the space, equipment, and flexibility and scheduling to accommodate it. Finally, and perhaps most obviously, you will likely have a range of staffing experiences on your team, with some folks familiar with the digitization process and others who are completely new to it. The team that you start with may not be the team you end with, depending on career decisions and the competing needs of your institution. Factoring in training and retraining time, plus time for recovery and regaining momentum is a must. Slide, please. So bearing these considerations in mind, some of you may be wondering if there's ever a good way to work with a vendor when you're on a tight budget. And the answer is yes. If you are working with a fixed budget, say from a grant-funded project, or if you've determined that you do not have the bandwidth institutionally to conduct a project locally, working with a vendor can be a great option. It's important to note up front, though, that even working with a vendor will require some in-house work, whether it's material selection or determining user needs or quality control and verification. Making the decision between completing your project in-house and working with a vendor is not an all or nothing proposition. Thus, if you're considering hiring a vendor to complete any part of your project, remember that all the same project management principles apply. You'll need to be very clear from the beginning about your project goals, your expectations, and budget, and be prepared to communicate with your vendor frequently and answer their questions along the way. All of this means being prepared with specifics. Things your vendor may ask you include the total number of pages to be digitized, whether the items are bound or loose, and if they are bound, can they be disbound? The exact dimensions, so what size scan bed will the item require? The stability of the item, can it withstand being scanned, and using what method? What are your desired output files, or DPI and PPI? What are your file naming conventions? How do you want the files named at the end? If you're vending out metadata creation, what kind of metadata are you looking to capture? Will the information be obvious in looking at the item, or does it require subject area expertise? And what are the guidelines for that metadata? And so on. Many vendors will be happy to work within your budget to meet your needs, and some will offer discounts based on existing institutional memberships. Make sure you're clear about your project deadline. Vendors are juggling many people's materials at once and will need to make sure that their production schedule fits your turnaround requirements. Many institutions require that you get a minimum number of quotes for projects above a certain cost threshold. Even if yours doesn't, don't be afraid to shop around. Vendors may be willing to compete with one another to get your business. You may help save yourself some money by providing your chosen vendor with a sufficiently sized hard drive that they can then mail back to you with your files. Many vendors will charge upwards of $100 for a new hard drive. Also, you may want to investigate shipping costs on your own if your institution receives any kind of discount. You may be able to save some money, though remember that the safety of your materials while in transit should be your primary concern. Slide. There are some times when working with a vendor is just a necessity. These times include when the needs of your materials exceed the capacity of your equipment and when you lack the local expertise. If you have items in your collection that are either too big or unwieldy to fit on your equipment, so think here of like very large scrapbooks or heavy court docket books or huge codices, you may need to seek the help of a professional. Likewise, if you have materials in rare or obsolete formats for which you simply do not have the equipment to image or transfer, like open reel film, wax cylinders, or three-dimensional objects perhaps, you may need to hire an appropriate vendor with specific expertise in that format. You do not want to risk damaging your materials in service of getting an image. Mary will discuss additional precautions and best practices during part 2 of this presentation tomorrow. Likewise, if you do not have staff in-house that know how to operate existing equipment, maybe it was purchased with grant funds and the only person to receive the training has moved on to a different institution, you will want to proceed with caution. Again, you don't want to risk damaging your materials or your equipment, particularly not if the latter is specialized or expensive. Finally, if you suspect that the materials you're working with are physically compromised in some way, whether owing to natural deterioration, mold, environmental damage, or other factors, you will need to first seek the help of a trained conservator before you can safely image the item. By subjecting fragile or damaged items to the increased handling and harsh light of imaging, you may do more harm to already delicate materials. Additionally, in the case of mold, You may expose undamaged items to risks they wouldn't otherwise be subject to. When in doubt, it never hurts to ask. Slide. Another way to dip your toes in the digital project waters is to run a pilot. Pilot projects help to test proof of concept without fully investing in wide-scale adoption. To run a successful pilot, you'll need to further narrow your project goals and scope, in most cases, sampling only a small fraction of the overall project's work. This will not only help you understand and tweak the project design, but will also help you assess your own bandwidth. For example, if you went 3 months over schedule on the pilot, it's likely that a full-scale project will take you much more time than you may have originally allocated. The steps of a pilot project closely mirror those of a larger digital project, with the addition of a final step, assessing and sharing a summary of your findings. It's important to not only ask for feedback, but also to tell folks what you heard. That way, you are accountable to the information you received, and you can clearly convey what changes will be made in the future. Some questions you might ask as you assess your pilot project might include, what would you need to expand the project? Financial resources, time, something else? What policies would be helpful regarding the care of digital objects or risk assessment, rights assessment, and so forth? Or is expert assistance necessary? The answers to these questions may beget other questions, but at least you'll know where to start. If your pilot project helps you understand what you really need are more specific collections development policy guidelines, that's a very different and very useful conversation to have. Slide. As I mentioned earlier, managing an in-house digitization project is more marathon than sprint, and project managers should be prepared for stops, starts, and setbacks along the way. The potential for these stops and starts increases as you involve more team members, especially if those individuals are volunteers or staff from other departments helping you out in their spare time. Remember that it's crucial that you document every step of your project so that you and your team can pick up where you left off. And lastly, don't forget that it's totally okay and even preferred to start small. There can be a temptation to go ahead and squeeze in as many digital objects or items into a project as you can, but that often backfires. It's far better to successfully complete a small project than to leave an overly ambitious one to the fates. Slide. All right, now that you know that you can never do too much project planning, let's move on to the next step in the digitization process. Metadata. Slide. For the purposes of doing digitization on a shoestring budget, I'm going to assume you'll be creating the metadata in-house. We've all heard the trope that metadata is data about data, which is so oft-repeated that it's basically meaningless. Metadata is the description of a resource that documents the identification, management, nature, use, or location of that resource. We need this additional description because there is often information about an item, say a photograph, that isn't inherent in the item itself, say dates, a location, or a title. There are lots of different types of metadata, but today we're going to focus on descriptive metadata, whose primary purposes are to enhance discoverability of the item and interoperability of the system that contains the metadata. For example, when we describe the title, date, and location of a photograph, we are creating metadata. That information can be searched for and the photograph can be found. If we structure that metadata according to a set of standards, then it in turn can be used by other systems, say the Digital Public Library of America, to also find and reference that photograph. If you refer to catalog records to search for information resources held by your library, you are using structured metadata. Slide. There are many different metadata schemas out there, and the Digital Library of Georgia uses one of the most widely adopted types called Qualified Dublin Core to describe digital objects in its portal. The Dublin Core schema is a set of 15 core vocabulary terms used to describe resources that can be digital or physical in nature. The qualified part refers to the few additional terms and refinements that can aid in resource discovery. DLG requires the 15 fields on your screen and strongly suggests an additional 4. 3 are optional. As you can see from the slide, these terms help describe an item or object, and the more description you provide, the more readily the resource can be found. We don't have time today to go through each of the terms and its guidelines or standards individually, but if that's something you or your team need, I encourage you to contact either myself or Mary, and we'll get you set up with the resources and trainings you need. Slide. This slide illustrates how the metadata terms and their fields are used in a typical DLG record. The image on the right, and I realize it's blurry, is what's being described, and the terms in red are from the qualified Dublin core schema. They are enlarged on the left to make them easier to see. So you can see that this item is a photograph, who the creator is, when it was created, what subject terms were used to describe it, and so on. And if this is simply too blurry to look at, the URL to this particular image is included in your slide deck. Slide, please. And this is what that metadata looks like in a spreadsheet. Again, very blurry, but I hope you can get the idea. I wasn't able to make the mechanics of a very wide spreadsheet work in slide view very well, but you can see from this clipped view that at the very top, you have the same metadata terms I listed on the previous slide. Each item in this collection constitutes one row on this spreadsheet. So some general tips when creating metadata are to take your time, to review the guidelines frequently, especially as you're still learning, to check your work. We recommend you stick to the facts, avoiding flowery language or excessive punctuation. Be sure to double check your file names. This is the key to unlocking your images. If the connection between the metadata and the images is lost, you will have a very big headache in front of you. And ask questions. It's okay to be unsure of your metadata early on. Thankfully, you have folks available to you for advice and consultation, so please use us. Slide. Included on this slide are some free things that you can take advantage of, both through the Digital Library of Georgia and through the State Library via Homeplace. You have options for hosting and archival storage, the DLG's wonderful subgranting program for up to $7,500 in DLG services, consultations and trainings, and many more things that I could not fit on this slide. So too with Homeplace, we provide equipment loaner kits for public libraries and their partners that include flatbed scanners, both the larger kinds that are more ideal for in-house scanning projects, and more portable scanners that can be taken out into the community, oral history kits, and a lot of other equipment as well. We provide project funding for public libraries and their partners. We provide intern placement and scholarships for public libraries, as well as consultations and trainings. Slide, please. So let's review. Today we talked about the project management triangle of constraints, about setting your goals and expectations for your digital project, determining your institutional and personal bandwidth to take on a project, some of the basic steps in digital project management, the digitization process, tips for smaller shops to help save money, metadata, and some free tools and resources. Slide, please. On this slide, you can get a whole bunch of great resources that I referenced in this presentation, plus a few others that I think are just really valuable. So I hope you'll give these a look after the presentation. Slide. That is my contact information. And now I will hand it back over to Sheila to see if there are any questions in the chat. Thank you.
So just a couple notes. If you would like a certificate of participation for the session, please email Dina at GALILEO. Her email address is dina.anderson at usg.edu. You can see it in your webinar chat. We will be sharing these slides on the DLG site, and Joy will be sending the slides out later. And I have a question about the bit.ly address.
Mary, that's on slide 2. It's bit.ly/shoestring1 and bit.ly/shoestring2.
Other questions? Well, if we don't have any questions, oh, here we have a couple. Yes, so there is a way that you can get a list of the websites that are listed. They'll be on that. They're available at that slide, on the slide deck that's at the bit.ly address. Yes. Angela, could you repeat the NOISE acronym that you shared?
Yes, it is needs, opportunities, improvements, strengths, and exceptions. So that's sort of like another analysis tool for your assessing your internal bandwidth and what opportunities you have and what external threats might be sort of weighing on your institution. I had not either, Rachel, so new to me as well.
Any other questions? Comments? Okay. Tim is asking, besides libraries, which organizations may have access to these Georgia resources or storage? The Digital Library of Georgia works with cultural heritage institutions throughout the state. So one of the provisos is that you have some sort of public access to your collections. So that means by appointment or regular hours. And so GALILEO members get slightly different levels of storage than non-GALILEO members, but all the consulting and metadata hosting and all of those services that DLG provides are free to any sort of memory institution in the state. We have another question from Lillian, wondering if there are any restrictions on digitization with COVID-19 as far as the Homeplace loans of equipment. So Angela?
Sure, yeah. Right now, the equipment is sheltering in place, but with the gradual increase in capacity with the Public Library statewide courier, it will be able to go out shortly. We were kind of giving the couriers time to catch up with all of the books and materials that needed to get out to the public libraries quickly. But we will make those available soon. The other thing I'm wanting to do is make sure that we have disinfectant included in those kits so that they can be cleaned both following use and before the next person's use. So both of those things are in the works, and they will be available soon. But yes, otherwise, you should, as a public library or as an external institution partnering with a public library, you would be able to get access to this shortly. Good question.
So I have a question from Deborah about whether or not the sub-grant program will continue given budget cuts. So since the state legislature has not finalized its budget yet, I cannot promise that we will be able to have a second round this year. However, I have put it in my budget request. I feel fairly positive that that we will have some additional funding. Other questions? Well, I'd like to thank Angela for her amazing presentation this morning. And just a couple of reminders, we'll have another DLG track session this afternoon at 2 on community digitization events. And then tomorrow, Mary Willoughby from DLG will be finishing off digitization on a shoestring at 10 a.m. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the Digital Library or at Georgia Homeplace. So thank you to all of you for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.